One of the things that I have always found really disturbing about American history, and particularly around our politics, is the Campaign of Erasure, which is something that I think is at the root cause of the Southern strategy. It was at the root cause of Jim Crow. It was at the root cause of not wanting and making it illegal for enslaved Africans to learn to read and write, right? The more that your mind is opened and education is allowed to flow in, the more that you question what is happening around you and to you. And so I want to, ask, as a former educator myself, who then went into education policy for a number of years, I have seen it as the key to our liberation, as has many civil rights leaders from across movements that have said the very same thing. Do you see, Kevin, some type of opportunity within this really disgusting and tragic obstacle that Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott and others who are copycatting the behavior of these white supremacists? Is there an opportunity here for educators, for people to say, well, wait a minute, we didn't really know what was happening to begin with, because our curriculum has been whitewashed in so many different ways. But now you're going out of your way, right? You're going above and beyond in terms of trying to deny people access to any perspective that is outside of white, cis, hetero, Christian male thinking. And so do you see any potential for there to be an opportunity within all of the obstacles that are being presented and originating in Florida, and the Republicans are hoping to nationalize if they were to gain power again in the Senate and in the White House?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to go to your larger point, the role of education here has always been the silver bullet, and African Americans have known this even before freedom. But certainly during the Reconstruction and then during Jim Crow, they knew that this was a powerful tool. The sight of free blacks in the South carrying books was akin to the sight of free blacks carrying guns. That's how the white society saw it. There was a joke that used to make its rounds in the South in the early 20th century about a northern visitor who comes down and visits the South, and the southern host picks him up at the railway station. And on their way out, they see two black men. One is asleep on a park bench, and one is studiously reading a newspaper. And seeing these two, the white southerner says, "Excuse me," walks over and kicks the black man who is reading a newspaper. And the northerner is confused. Why would you do that? I think you would kick the one who was lazy and sleeping on the job. He goes, "He ain't the one we're worried about." So this has been a touchstone of white supremacy forever. The realization that education blows up the entire project, right? And as we talk about in this book, there are various points along our history in which white supremacists have sought to rewrite the narrative. The most obvious one is the fight over Confederate monuments in the South. The Confederate monuments weren't put up right after the Civil War. No, they were put up largely in the 19-teens and 1920s, and then again in the 1950s and 1960s, precisely when white Southerners were trying to cement white supremacy and Jim Crow in the South, right? It is an effort to rewrite history. A reimagining of the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights struggle of the 1960s is another one. Highly contested, deeply unpopular, challenging to the core of American ideals of democracy, capitalism across the board. Martin Luther King presented a stark challenge to America, and yet he's been sanitized and sterilized and reduced down to one sentence all Republican politicians know from the March on Washington speech. And that's the only one they seem to know, and the only one they think he ever said. He's much
the content of your character, Kevin. All I judge you by is the content of your character.
That's it. The problem is I think we're judging them by the content of their character now. But look, I mean, but that's what DeSantis is doing in Florida, right? He said, look, he gave this speech where he said, all we have to do is give the cut and dried history, which is never cut and dried. And he says we should talk about these great Americans who stood up even when it wasn't easy. Okay, some follow-up questions there. Why wasn't it easy for them? And why did they have to stand up, right? And once you start to ask those questions, you start to get into the things that they don't want to talk about kind of systemic structural racism. Again, things that King talked about during the 1960s And yet we've erased all that. Glenda Gilmore has a piece in our book about the good civil rights protests. We've sterilized and sanitized King and made him seem distant from what's going on today. No, Black Lives Matter today is talking about the same stuff King talked about. Structural racism, police brutality, the dangers of capitalism. It's all there, right? So yes, there is an opportunity today to take this challenge and not take it lying down, but to come back with the facts, to come back and say, no, look, we've got the record here and you're distorting it. You're the one with an ideological crusade. You're the one with a political agenda here. And it's not the teachers in the classroom who are simply relating facts.
And, you know, and what, you know, you and Danielle are talking about, there's an opportunity, there's a moment to fight back and push back. But throughout American history, there have always been people like us who have tried to push back. And a colleague of yours, a great historian, Carol Anderson, wrote this book called White Rage, where if you haven't read it, you all should read it. And we'll have her on our show one of these days, where she talks about, in 200 pages, every single attempt to try to correct the record, not rewrite the record, but add more chapters, right? To progress this country towards this thing called the American dream, where all of us, regardless of our skin tone, or if we have ovaries or not, have a chance at at equality. We have been met with white rage and violence every step of the way. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so, looking at what we're looking at right now with Florida, the kickstart seemed to have been the 1619 Project, right? Mm-hmm. Nicole Hannah-Jones edits this New York Times Magazine issue, which, God forbid, says, hey, you know what? Let's start the history in 1619 when enslaved people were brought here against their will, and let's just add a chapter. One would assume people would say, oh, well, this is interesting. This so thoroughly rattled white supremacy in the GOP that they unleashed this barrage for the past 3 or 4 years. We're going to go after DEI. We're going to go after CRT. We're going to ban 1619. How dare you say 1619? I mean, talk about the world's most fickle, weak snowflakes, right? And so the question I have is, every time that we try to fight back, white rage meets us with violence and intimidation. We're seeing it right now.
Yeah.
What can and what should white colleagues, especially your white colleagues right now, do to help people like me and Danielle, who, you know, we do what we do, we get called crazy and we get exhausted. And I feel like we're living like Groundhog's Day all over again in 2023.
Well, I mean, you know, speaking for myself, and I was somebody involved in the 1619 Project from the magazine version and now in the book version, the blowback to that was really remarkable. My piece of the 1619 Project was taken directly out of my first book. And, you know, 15 years ago, God, I'm old, but taken out of that book and built on scholarship that was, you know, standard in the field. And yet the reaction to this was stunned, you know, as if
amazing.
I made something up entirely rather than simply replicating what an entire field has done. Urban historians have talked about, my piece was about traffic in Atlanta and the way in which segregation shaped the highway system. This is a standard old story. When I proposed this for 1619, I almost felt embarrassed because I was like, well, we all know this story, right? I guess I could talk about this thing we all know. And yet the reaction of the public is one of shock. And it just shows the disconnect between what the general public thinks they know and what academics have. And that's, again, the motivation of this whole book. The Smith America book has been to address that. What can white scholars do? Well, I've always taken it as, I've got every privilege in the book. I'm a straight, white, cishet, Christian, Southern man. I've got everything. I'm at a private university and I've got tenure. I've got no excuse not to wade into this, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not alone on that. I have lots of colleagues, many of whom don't check all those boxes of privilege that I have, who are engaged in this too, and are pushing back. And I think the beauty of our moment is that for however much chaos and confusion is being spread out there, especially on social media, those same forums give us a lot of us the ability to push back, right? So it's become a two-way argument. And it can be frustrating. It can seem, I often feel on Twitter, I'm mopping back the ocean, and what's the point? But you know, I'd rather do that than sit on my hands. And if it's futile, it's futile. But I'm going to go down swinging, and luckily a lot of scholars are too, because this matters. This isn't just some academic discussion about the past, as you guys know. History informs policy. The past informs the present. What we think we we're able to do or had done in the past shapes our sense of what we can do in the future. So I think this is vitally important. And again, I'm lucky that I'm not alone in this.